If you can wave the wand and get like the perfect capability set with someone who's like deeply convicted about your mission and has all the right values, that one decision can save you like a huge amount of expense and annoyance and labor and effort down the road. And so if you're going to overinvest in one decision, I think it's who you bring on the team.
Hey guys, Damian Stevens, host of MSP Mindset. I've had the amazing opportunity to speak with Dave Kline today about how can you become a better leader. We got into the nitty gritty from how do you lead to how do you hire to the mindset. The secret one that's holding me back is probably holding you back. Why would you want to listen to Dave? He has led at Fortune 500, Big Four Consulting, and the world's largest hedge fund. He's run 2 to 200 person teams, including running Moody's and almost a $400 million business. So if you want to know a guy that has failed his way through all these things and distilled down the leadership secrets for us to learn, then dive in and let me know your thoughts. What do you see as one of the most common challenges or mistakes that we're making as leaders?
Well, I think I'm trying to go to what is most universal that I see repeating at different levels of leadership. I think one of them is I have a slide very early in our program, and it just has 5 words on it. It just says, "That's okay, I'll do it." And I describe these as the 5 most dangerous words any leader can utter. And the reason I break them down sort of word by word, I'm like, well, that's okay. Well, actually, anytime we say that, it's not okay. They came up short of the expectation or they underperformed. And so the problem with the first 2 words is like, you're not even being honest. You're not giving them the accurate signal about just how well it is going or not going, whether it was on the mark or off the mark. And so at a minimum, you're eroding trust. At a maximum, it's like disingenuous and confusing.
Right.
Then the next word is "I'll." And so again, you're trying to lead. You're trying to create a system that can achieve more because we've brought people together than any of these individuals could have done on their own. Once you say "I'll," you're taking it all back. Right? You're bringing it back inside of the constraint that is, how many hours are you willing to work? And then do it. Again, if we're leading, we are empowering people. We are teaching people. We are accelerating the compounding of what we can do because everyone is getting more capable, more competent, covering more area. When it just goes to do it, you're back down in execution. And execution doesn't compound. It's not getting any better versus teaching, developing, sharing. That's how we have the exponential curve sort of start to climb. So every time we utter those words, we're sort of taking it all back and we're sort of restarting the clock. And so I would say that's probably the most universal problem I see, because I see frontline managers doing that, but I see CEOs doing the same thing, right? And probably the most dangerous spot to do it is when it is your superpower, right? If you're if you became CEO through the sales track and all of a sudden your head of sales starts to wobble, you're like, oh, that's okay, I'll just do it. Or maybe you came up the tech track, and so therefore you're like you used to be the CTO and now you're running the company, and you're like, you just drift into that. And you're like, oh, that's okay, I'll tell you what the architecture should be. I'll solve that problem.
Yeah, I like those blinky lights, so why not jump right back in?
Right?
Yeah, I can relate to that. So if I'm, just put myself in this, right? If I'm establishing the first set of leaders, and I at least I think I'm aware enough to realize now my job is not the direct reports as much as is the leaders. So talking to me, talking to any entrepreneur listening to this, how do I make sure I do the opposite of what you just said? As I'm establishing the first, second, and third, I feel like there's a different set of challenges when I have a whole leadership team, but as I'm establishing the leadership team and building that out, how do I avoid that's okay, I'll do it, that there's a lot in that, the way you unpack it. But how do I get started with that?
Well, I think the starting point has to be, do we have a shared, I don't get too precious about which words we want to use, vision, mission, purpose, but do we have agreement on what excellent looks like? Like, what are we trying to build? Where are we trying to go? And I say, like, is that shared? Because a lot of times, you're the original founder, you're the CEO, and you're like, allow me to just declare what this is. And I think that if you want people to really step up and assume leadership roles, maybe they all get there, but I think part of your job is to get them to put their hands all over it too, to get them to become, in the best form, to become co-authors of that picture. And the reason that becomes so important to me is because then they never get to fall back on the excuse of like, well, that was your vision, not mine, or that was your why, not mine. It's like, no, we created this. We built this together. Okay, so we set this point in the distance. And the reason that point becomes so important is then when I pull back and say, I need leaders of different domains, and then I need them to sort of develop their teams, their managers or their direct reports, et cetera. That becomes how you evaluate all those local decisions. You're sort of, each one of them can go into their respective area and say, okay, well, where am I? Okay, I have that vision way in the future that we all share. What are the biggest obstacles I have to take down to go from where I am to where I want to be? And that allows them to lead without turning back to the person. If they're the only, like if you're the leader and you haven't done that first part, then you have to become the answer to everything. So now you're basically, whether you meant to or not, you have structurally built into the system everybody coming to your door, knocking on it and saying, what do I do? Versus because we have a clear destination, we have competent leaders, they can go and say, I can make most of these judgments myself. I can apply my understanding, my expertise, which hopefully is higher than yours because they're specialists in their respective areas, and make it so that 1 + 1 = 3. So I think that's where I would start.
Is it the ultimate mission long term? Not BHAG, whatever words you want to put on it. Is that clarity at the 5-year, the 1 year, using US terms, the quarterly rocks? Like, is the answer yes to all of those things?
This is like me betraying the baseball card that I have. I don't do well in absolutes. So I don't know exactly would be the answer. I would say probably something aspirational. So whether that's the BHAG or the vision or whatever else, but just some, like if I just use our business, right? My business, the totality of my business is my wife and I right now. So there's not like a giant team to lead. We occasionally try to lead each other. We mostly lead ourselves, and it took us a while to say like, well, what is our aspiration? What is that thing out there? And we settled on like helping 1 million leaders level up. Now that's not very precise. I don't know if that's over the next year or the next 20 years. But I know that we've been blessed to work at companies that had great leadership. Like they've invested millions of dollars into leadership development. We both happen to have good individual leader experiences for us that helped our career. And yet there's a stat where it says 60% of all managers fail. And I'm like, well, how that we know we can do more together than apart. And yet it's worse than a coin flip to say yes to becoming a manager at any level. That seems fixable. And so that's sort of what set us out to do that. And so I don't know, maybe it'll be 10 million leaders, maybe it'll be 500,000 leaders. What does leveling up really mean? But we know we just want to help people get better and skip the mistakes we made. And then I think that you do need something more tangible in a shorter horizon, right? To sort of, I think this is when you get closer to like having a number, right? Or having a scoreboard, just to say, not because you have to be beholden to it, not because you have to do ridiculous things to achieve it, but just how do you know if you're tracking well? Like, how do you know if you are taking a material step in that direction? And I just think it depends a little bit on the shape of your business and a little bit on what you're like in running it. Maybe that is quarterly, maybe that is annually. Like for us, we sort of set a couple high level, like, hey, this, in year one, we just wanted to, we honestly had no objective. We just like wanted to get started. It was really meant to be complementary to the business we bought. And by the end of the year, it had outrun the business we bought. So in year 2, we said, well, could it fully replace us having worked full time? And we achieved that. And so now in year 3, we're like, well, could we double it? And that was sort of the headline. And then we started to refine, but how started to matter to us, right? Like, would one way to double is just work twice as much. Like, that wasn't really winning in our mind.
Right.
And so we started to say, like, well, what's the shape of that? But I think without some sort of more tangible interim milestone, I could keep chasing that $1 million aspiration in ways that don't really achieve what I want to achieve. And then we do rocks on a quarterly basis.
Have you ever wondered if you could recover your backups? Let me ask a better question. Have you ever had a backup fail to recover? Have you ever lost data? Yeah, that's me. Here's what's crazy. 58% of recoveries fail to recover. So if you think it's just you, you couldn't be more wrong. What are we going to do about that? Well, you've got two options. Enter Servosity. What we do and what we exist to do is test your backups and manage them for you. We test every volume, every single day. We do weekly testing, monthly testing, and quarterly testing. And you can hand off the drudgery and babysitting of backups and the day-to-day management to our team that monitors your backups for you. It's time to level up your backup game. One way you can do that is visit servosity.com/learn more if you'd like to take the process that I've spent the last 18 years building and steal it and apply it to your MSP so that you can level up your backup game. Check out the link below in the description or visit servosity.com/learn more. Okay. All right. Good. Yeah. No, I think that helped me tie it together because using your example, right? If you're going to help 1 million leaders level up and you're at whatever number it is today, 10, 1,000, 10,000, whatever, then there's still a long way to go, which isn't bad. It just, I know that I can relate to that. You know, we want to save 1 million people from ransomware. But if we're at, if
that should take you like
tens
a week.
Of thousands.
So much ransomware these days.
That's right. That's right. That there is a lot of opportunity. But when you're making the decisions, when you're trying to go from 10,000 to 50,000 or 100,000 or 200,000, let alone 1 million, you need something in the middle. You need some, like, this quarter, did I achieve? Did I get the rock done this year? Did I hit the goal? Like, I think it's good to understand the aspirational, but how loosely, in your opinion, do I tie that back? Is it the old leadership style of, the number was X and you didn't hit X, so that's horrible. Is it, you hit 99% of X, like how I need to think about getting rid of you, like, the old school, really bad leadership. I'm sure it's not that, but how do you establish these goals that hopefully are aspirational and usually are some form of stretch? Yeah. Just kind of like you were talking about earlier.
I would say that the thing that I believe very firmly is, like, there is probably no skill more powerful than being clear about your expectations. Now, in your example, there's a lot of different ways to give expectations that are clear. And so let me just sort of paint two sides of the spectrum that I've lived both of, and they come with different pros and cons. So the first real 10 years of my career was Moody's. And the way that we would set goals was the closer, you probably wouldn't get fired if you got to 99% of a goal. But it was closer to what you're saying. Like, goals were set with the expectation of being met. And so I would say the goals were a bit more modest. And they were very thoughtful from a capacity perspective. And that was more doable because the business was more predictable. And it's more suited the culture that we were running. But what was good is that was clear. Like, it was clear that, yes, you have 3 goals for your team, and the expectation is you'll hit all 3 goals or maybe slightly beat them, et cetera. Then flip over to my 10 years of Bridgewater, which we ran very differently. It was run like a portfolio. It was at the highest level on down to each individual. The goal was to get people to hit 60 to 75% of their target, right? So that means, a third is failure. Right. So you would be meeting my expectation if you only achieve 75% of what you set out to do. That's like a very different mindset for people. You're like, because A, they're not used to failing. B, so how do you judge that? I would say, like, for us, our rocks are closer to the second, where we try to set them pretty high targets and then say, okay, our goal one, we had 15 rocks when we started, so we got rid of 10 of them. We said, okay, we've now picked the most important rocks. And within those, if we were to either crush 5 and miss 1, like massively, or to sort of get Bs on all of them, that's about what we would expect. But again, that works because we're being clear with ourselves about what we're truly shooting for and what we're not. Where I think people get really hung up is you might set aspirations like I'm doing in the second version, which are really high targets, probably not achievable, but then holding people accountable to more like the first way I described it, which is like, you got to hit them all. Or being schizophrenic about it, which is like whatever suits you. Like, oh, you actually got to 80% on all the things. I really meant it was 100. And I'm like, there's nothing that erodes trust more with people than sort of rewriting the contract mid-flight. Like maybe you wrote a bad contract, but then like, so be it. You'll get to rewrite it next quarter.
That's right.
But I think the clarity is what is key.
I want to dig deeper on the clarity. As I'm building up my team, I'm hiring the expert. I'm not the expert. So let's say in an MSP that I'm now hiring the first, service leader, and operational, technical service, running help desk support tickets, that kind of thing. Right. I could say the KPI is, tickets closed or ticket response time or NPS or, whatever those things are. But I wonder if I don't lean on the expert, if you've done this at three different companies before you've joined us, how do we co-create a goal that's actually more meaningful or metrics? Because obviously you can make numbers or metrics or KPIs, do anything, even to the harm. But like, if you want tickets closed quickly, you don't have to do a good job, right? You can just close them really quickly. So you got to be careful what you're asking for. So how do we co-create the right metrics? If I'm hiring the expert and I'm at least self-aware enough to ask the question that I might set, number of tickets closed or speed of ticket, resolution, and that could actually do the opposite of what I'm looking to do, which is provide amazing service and be great for our team or great for our customers, when maybe that really incents the team to do the opposite.
Yeah. I think you end up having a few levers you can pull, and maybe you're pulling one or maybe you're doing a combination of them. I think it's pretty dangerous to oversee people where you literally have no threshold level of understanding. And so that doesn't mean you need to go become the expert in that managed service technical detail in the same way that you've now hired that expertise. But it's probably not very good if you have literally no idea what's going on. And so like, what are the quick ways you come up the curve, right? Is that external research? Is that talking to 3 other experts? Sometimes people use their interview process to sort of build their own threshold understanding. This is when you can bring in, outside expertise. Like there's lots of different ways we go from not knowing anything to knowing at least enough to be able to like navigate the foreign country, so to speak. So I think that's one. So I'd say like, if people aren't doing that, I would figure out like, how do you get to that threshold? The second thing is, and I'd say this to people often, we underestimate sort of the power of the analogies that we've lived for the purposes of asking better questions about what we haven't. So an example of that would be, I was trying to run a training program back at Bridgewater, and I had a person who was going to run that. And they were like, I don't even know where to start. I don't know how to frame up this factory we're creating, et cetera. And I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. Didn't you graduate from college like a year ago? And they're like, well, yeah. And I'm like, so you have no idea what it would take to take a body of people and give, have a clear curriculum with credible instructors and good certification to educate them in a particular way that then on the output, we would say, like, we believe this person is capable of doing these things. You'd have no idea what that might look like. And they're like, oh, yeah, I guess I do. And so like, it wasn't me condescending. It's like, actually, if you step back, we run into almost all these things all the time. And so I imagine if you're an MS, you're a managed service provider, and you've probably have been doing some of this, maybe it's a different domain. And so you're like, okay, but just abstract one level and say like, well, what are all the key parts of that domain abstracted one level? And then can you ask the questions over here in the same way? Right. And so you were already doing it in your setup of the question. You were like, oh, like in this world, it would, like ticket times would be really important, but I wouldn't want people to game ticket times at the expense of quality. How are you thinking about setting up the tensions so those two things? Is that relevant in this world or not? And if so, how are you setting it up? Like you were able to probe and ask those questions, even though you don't know the literals of like the ticketing. And they might say like, oh, in this world, the ticketing duration is very different for this reason. And you're now building your threshold understanding even more, and still using the expertise you already have, one level abstracted, to like ask better questions and probe that. The third thing to think about is what I would ask. It's like a little hard in the theoretical, but like, what's the incentive structure? Like, is that person strictly salary? Are they bonus in some way? Do they have equity in the company? Sometimes you can allow for more latitude in the specific like KPIs, depending on what the higher order incentives are, right? If that person only gets paid if that business grows, or only gets paid if like in equity over the long term, you can sort of rely on that to probably offset any sort of near-term mistakes in the KPIs. And so that might be another thing to like stare at and look at.
That makes a ton of sense. What do you think the role and do you have a recommendation for it being, above salary? In other words, you recommend bonus, do you recommend equity or stock some form of equity, or just, tying a metric, whether that's commission or bonus or ownership in some form above salary? Or do you think salary works just as well at a leadership level?
Again, you're going to get so annoyed by the end of the podcast. I'm like, well, it kind of depends. But I think it does. Like, I think at the leadership level, you do want some amount of performance tied to their outcome. So whether you choose to do that through bonus or equity, et cetera, a little of that depends on like the structure of your business and whether you want to give up ownership or not. A little bit depends on the types of people you're going to attract. Some would be usually ownership, right? Is people willing to defer near-term gains for a bigger long-term gain. Again, I don't know if that is the archetype of who you are attracting or not. So it's a little bit like I need to know the types of like players I want in my business and what I'm most comfortable as the owner doing. I think it's hard. I think it's hard to maintain full ownership and have no performance-based incentives and end up with leaders who are going to make rational decisions. What's the Charlie Munger quote? So show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. I think there's some truth to that. And so I would be looking for like, how can I get them to feel more ownership, or at least only gain the upside when they've contributed to creating it.
Right. Yeah. And so even if you don't want to do ownership, right, just using your suggestion that you can have performance, whether that's
profit sharing, commission,
or bonus or profit sharing.
Lots of different ways to do it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think in a lot of the businesses, tie it to profit, not revenue, right? You pay attention, because otherwise you'll sell a ton of low margin,
right?
And pay a ton. So like the Charlie Munger quote, show me those and I'll understand those outcomes. Show me those incentives. Tell me how this, I was really curious about this. Tell me about your insights of how this leadership ties into parenting and how teaching those and what you've learned being a parent.
Well, we were joking before we hit record, right? That any leader who says they have it all figured out is lying to you and lying to themselves. And so
that's right.
That probably is only doubly true for parents. I would say one surprise.
And before you answer that, Dave, sorry. Tell me about your kids. How old are they?
We have two daughters, 12 and 14, about to be 13 and 15. So we're about to double dip the teenagers.
Okay.
I was going to say, if I rewind the clock, I don't think I fully appreciated how much having kids would make me a better manager or leader, and how being a manager leader actually helped me be a better parent. Like they are remarkably intertwined, I think. So like an example, when your kids sort of experience the world for the first time, like everything's miraculous and wonderful, and they're so curious. And I think most of us as parents are like so patient with that, We're like, of course, like you're seeing this for the first time. Of course that would be foreign to you or scary to you or like something you needed to touch and break. Of course.
Yeah.
And then we turn around to these professionals, these adults around us, and we're shocked that they would do the same thing. But to some degree, if you step back, you're like, well, of course, like this organization is new to them, or this project is new to them, or this challenge is new to them, or this strategy, like, and they're just people too. So you're like, of course. But somehow I don't think I was I was probably far more arrogant about it before I had kids. I'm like, why are you not getting this? Why are you not figuring this out? Like, I'm pretty sure if anyone had experienced me as a manager before kids and then after, they'd be like, what happened to you? And I was like, oh, I had kids and like saw I have a new appreciation for what it's like to be a human in the world. And so I see that. And at the same time, one of the gifts, especially my time at Bridgewater, was sort of seeing, we were always thinking about things as being another one of those. Like, what is the pattern? What is the repeating thing? Like I don't know if anybody else had this experience. We all have these things that we believe make us these snowflakes. And so one of them for me is like, I love live music. Probably my apex year in New York City, I went to something like 65 live shows in a calendar year. I just loved it. I have the most eclectic, interesting, unique musical tastes. And I remember when Pandora first came out and you sort of had to like give it a few songs and it would eventually, in my mind, over a couple years, figure out who I was. And I like gave it 3 songs. And the next 10 songs were like bands I had gone to see live last year. And I was like, what? Wow. I am such a unique, like, I'm so unique. How could this thing possibly know? And it was like this big like moment of, nah, man, you're not that unique. Like, there are only so many flavors and only so many differences. And so you can sort of see that in management, right? Like people are like, well, does your program apply to small business or large corporations? Does it apply to new managers or seasoned managers? And every marketing bone in our bodies, like we have to like niche down and be super precise, but it's all the same stuff. You have like everybody is struggling with an underperforming employee. Everybody wishes their manager gave them more clarity in terms of what that excellent looks like. Everybody wishes they could go out into the market and cherry pick the perfect star who would hit the ground running on day one. Like we all have these same things. And so that also helped me bring an appreciation back into my house, right? Like sort of seeing those abstractions and those patterns, and then to turn around and be like, oh, like my kids are going to go through the same thing. That like my firstborn is going to exhibit characteristics different than my secondborn. And while it's not a fate, it's probably going to be predictable. And then starting to think about them in different ways, and like how do we motivate them and how do we help them arrive at the next sort of individual challenge they want to take on is not different than me doing that with a professional who wants a promotion. Anyways, I think that they are so intertwined that if I could gift a new manager also being a parent, I think it would accelerate them up the curve much faster.
Yeah. Yeah. I've definitely seen like, especially when the kids are young, because it's just like, well, there's the nature versus nurture type debate. And sometimes they're just like, how did they do that? How did they figure that out? Like they just came with that programmed and they decided to start doing that. Or where did they even pick up that? Because sometimes you see, I see myself in them or my wife in them, and others, I just see things that are very different, very, like them, their personality. And I've tried to let people be that same way, right? Like, wow, look, just because you have, I think sometimes they go, oh, because you went to the same school or you, that this other person did or worked at the same company, you're going to, act the same way, which is probably akin to saying, your brother or sister from the same parent, you're the same person there.
Right.
Right. That's not, it's funny. I think I do that when you have similar, training, schooling, career experience, but, don't do that when you're a brother or a sister in a family. I don't expect you to be the same. So why do we expect that, from a career development path?
Well, and we have this amazing ability to flex. Like most programs will use some flavor of this. We use Principles U, which is it was a personality test that Ray created with Adam Grant. after we had gotten over reliant on MBTI, which is like dubious in its science. So they're like, oh, can we create MBTI but actually be science backed? And so we use it in our program. And to your point, it's like such an interesting set of conversations because you can compare two people, right? And so maybe I'm deeply extroverted and someone else is deeply introverted. And so you might say like, well, ooh, in some circumstances, that's going to create a lot of conflict, right? In other circumstances, that might be great to have a team where I've got things, people at both preferences on the end of the spectrum. But the other thing that like is an important part of the conversation is we'll say like traits are not fates. Right? Like these are preferences. Just because you prefer to be introverted doesn't mean you have no ability whatsoever to flex when necessary. But it also means in moments of stress and pressure and chaos, you will likely revert back to what is most natural. And it's like a sort of a long-winded way to sort of reinforce what you're saying, which is like, well, at some level, there are some parts of nature which we should acknowledge because in those moments, we are probably going to retreat to them. But people have this really finicky way of being flexible and agile and developing and growing. And if you do those tests over time, you'll also see people shift, right? And so we can grow, we can develop, we can get better. And that, again, a lot of what I think is like in my mind, one of the conversions when someone goes from being an okay leader to like an excellent one is when they stop seeing so many ors and start seeing more ands, right? Like, we are.
What does that mean?
You know what I mean? Like we are not.
Give me an example of that.
What's that?
Give me an example. What does that mean?
Well, even in that example, right? Like we might say, like people are fixed by, people have certain abilities and capabilities, or they can change. But I'm like, no, it's and. People do have certain preferences and fixed capabilities, and they can change. And so how do I deal with the and? Like people want, it's like simpler if I can just say it's this way or it's that way. Because if people were fixed, then I never have to do any development or coaching. All I have to do is find people who fit. And if they don't fit, I fire them and find someone else who fits. Or if everyone is malleable and we can change them, well, I can just hire whoever I want and put all my effort into like a development program and teaching leaders, and I can convert anybody into being what I need them to be. And the reality is like those are neat and tidy, but not real. The real part is when you say like, well, both are true, is an and. And so how do I build my system to deal with that reality? Like just to give you like another version, there's this idea which I've walked around with, is this idea of being open-minded and assertive. When people first hear that, they think about like, oh, well, depending on the situation, it's a spectrum that I should shift on. So if I'm in a situation where I don't know much of anything, I should be very open-minded because that's like humble and the right thing to do. I don't know anything. And if I'm in a situation where I'm the expert, I should be very assertive because like I'm the expert and people should listen to me. In reality, the most impactful people actually maintain both. It's an and. Even in situations they don't know anything, they are forcing themselves to independently try to figure it out. Like what is, sort of back to our example earlier where you don't know the technical details. Well, how are you going to craft and build a picture that is independent so that when this expert is telling you something, you can be like, yeah, that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense. I should ask more questions. And then the open-mindedness is, okay, no matter how expert I am, and I've built that picture, the laws of just volume and data would tell you there's no way you have even like 1/10 of 1/1,000,000% of the information needed to create the perfect picture. So you should be deeply humble and open that there's something that could change that picture, right? And so it's not a spectrum where you're picking on one side or the other. It is you are solving a simultaneous equation. Something
akin to strong convictions, but loosely held. Yeah, that kind of, they get spread around. No, I love that. But you brought up something I wanted to ask about how, because I definitely believe the and, I have certain abilities and weaknesses but I am able and capable of changing. So, whether it's about me, whether it's about others on the team that I'm leading, how do I determine how malleable, how much, how far, right? It goes back to like you can make the right decision or you can make the decision right type of thinking. And so how do I balance that or think about this? I've clearly hired the wrong person and I can't get them to there versus, maybe they're not everything I needed day one, but they are malleable enough. They're willing to learn. It is an and. So how, since it's not as clear as, binary 1 or 0, how do I kind of assess that as I'm assessing people? And I don't mean an assessment, but how do I understand that?
Well, let's use it's probably easiest for people if we just say, like, there's someone who's underperforming. We can come back to it if it's want to outperform, but let's just pick the one that usually causes people the most pain is this person is underperforming. And so we'll often get asked the question, okay, so how do I deal with that? I usually ask people to sort of walk through 4 questions. I would say the first 2 are your problem and the second 2 are their problem. But because ultimately they're performing on your team, the whole thing's your problem. But anyways,
yes.
I start with, well, what am I setting these people up for success, right? Do they have clear expectations? Like, do they know what is expected of them? Did they know that walking in the door? Has it changed, et cetera? But like, people can't win a game they don't know what the scoreboard is or what the rules are. So like, do they know that? And the second one is going to be, do they have like the necessary support? And I would say, like, maybe use the word reasonable. Reasonable being, if I took someone off the street and dropped them into this job and gave them the same support, could they do it? Because you can get to people who are like, they never have enough. And it's just like an endless, like, I need more training, I need more guidance, I need more access. And that's just not the way to optimize the team. So you do need to have some, again, independent perspective of what's reasonable. But I think those 2 will mostly fall to the manager, to the leader of the team, to say, this is where we're going. This is how I'm keeping score. This is how we're going to do the work, or how I need you to do the work, or how I need you to run your team or grow our business. And I think this is the training you need, the access you need, the support you need, the resources, the tools, whatever else. And the reason I start with those 2 is because if you don't get buy-in that they have what they need, when you get to the second 2, which are about them and are much harder, these things become excuses. And so I'm like, just get the excuses off the board. Like, I've given you all these things. Do you agree this is what you need to succeed? Like, this is the training you need. This is the access, et cetera. The second 2 become skill and will. And I would start them in opposite order, which, to your point, do they want to do it? Like, when in terms of, and the wanting can be 2 different versions. Wanting is like, do you actually want to do the job? Sometimes we think a job or a project is one thing and we get into it and we're like, oh, it's kind of like me running the data team. I'm like, I'm going to get operational experience. And I'm like, oh, I'm not good at this and I don't like it. And so like, I didn't want to do it. If I was being honest with myself, the problem was probably skill, but the skill was so bad that will was really the issue. It's like, I didn't want to do it, nor did I want to do the work to close the gap, which I think becomes the second one within will. But let's say they have clear expectations, they have the resources, support, and training, and they want to do it, and or they are willing to like make the investment to close the gap. You're now just left to like, well, can they do it? Like, do they have the capabilities? And this is that like messy gray area for managers where you have to sort of apply the judgment. For me, I tend to put 2 lenses on it that will be clarifying for people. So one is, well, what's reasonable? If I look through 20 years of different levels of roles and whatever, I would say usually you will know, like, someone should be able to get to the expectation within 6 to 9 months. Now, if you're a smaller team, if you're an A player only organization, that might be a shorter time frame that you can actually tolerate, because really you're judging them, not can they ever get to that expectation, but can they get to the expectation in a time that produces a positive ROI for the business? Like, can they get there in business time? You're not judging them as a person and an inability to change. You're basically saying, can this player play the position before we lose the season, before we run out of, before we go out of business if we're a small company? The second lens I'll put on it for folks is, if you've ever had a star work for you, it doesn't take 6 to 9 months. Like, usually I would say within a month or 2, if you have a star. And again, especially for smaller organizations, you probably need more stars than not. Now, stars aren't universal. They can be stars in your context. Like, someone might be terrible at IBM or Accenture and be brilliant in a 10-person MSP, because they're going to like having a smaller shop, having a different book of business, working with small business owners. Like, there's all kinds of reasons why someone might have failed there and be excellent for you. But that's in that,
and vice versa.
Yeah. But I'm sort of like,
Yeah,
when
right.
people are usually asking me, like, do I have an underperformer? And they've done the first three, like, you've given them what they need. They have clear expectations. They want it, and they're still not performing. And I'm like, well, how long has it been? And they say 3 years. And I'm like, so you know your answer. You're just asking me to confirm it for you. Right. And I would say that's like 90% of the time. Is like, I'm like, we're not in the 6 to 9 months, and we're certainly not in the 1 to 2 months that is a star. And it's really hard. The thing that if I could gift anybody anything when it comes to underperformers is the pain you feel making that decision will never be higher than the point of the decision. But with 20 years of data, most of those people are in just as much pain as you are. No one likes to be constantly losing. Like, I hated being in that job where I was just like, every day I'm like, I'm not good at this. I'm losing. The scoreboard never is in my favor. I'm letting my team down. So like, I was in pain and the company was in pain. And then all of a sudden you put me in a spot where I can thrive and put the person who came in behind me was awesome at that job. Everyone wins. And what's funny is I've watched it happen over and over and over. I've had people who worked in my team or worked in like adjacent teams. Like they got to the point where it felt like they couldn't tie their shoes. They left, and I can think of at least 3 who started billion-dollar companies. And you're like, okay, so they're not incompetent people. They just were in the wrong spot. And so that data, I don't know, when you're a new manager, you feel like you're ruining someone's life. You might actually be opening up the chapter to like the life they should be living. And sometimes people need a nudge, and you need a team that can achieve your goals. And so if that gives you a little more confidence, I promise it works out for most people.
Yeah, let them bloom in a different garden, right? Sometimes I found if I'm particularly aware, maybe there's a different role, like you described your experience within the same company, and sometimes that's at a different company. I would challenge you to think about yourself, because I look back, and no matter how painful letting somebody go was, I look back across, and I never, all the times I've had to let somebody go, which it's been painful every single time. I'm not sure it's gotten any easier.
No.
Not once have I looked back and regretted letting somebody go. So with a little self-reflection, all I'm admitting about myself is that means, upon self-reflection, I think that I'm not the kind that jumps, just randomly does something and just jumps to conclusions and does it too fast, which means I am probably a good bit of the time doing it too slow. So, now I start to understand when I'm thinking that, when I'm already feeling those things, I can really examine a couple data points, and I don't need to wait 3 years. If I'm 3 months or 6 months in, I've given them long enough, depending on what it is, then I know. And if I violate that, where I do feel like I fired too fast, then I can re-examine some things. But, just from personal perspective, because it's so painful, I just keep that rock in my shoe, and I just keep walking around.
We, one of the CEOs we worked with, we were in-house running a program, and it was sort of like junior to mid-level sales managers, pretty big company, and the CEO had been a part of it for 40 years. Like he'd owned it. I think sold part of it to private equity, bought it back, but basically had been in the driver's seat for a huge chunk of the time. And it's a recruiting company, and so he came in to do this Q&A, and someone was asking like, well, do we really live the values? What's your example? What's your evidence? And he said, look, based on the ownership structure, if you look at our number one sales rep, who does, dozens of recruiting placements a year, I profit personally on the order of about $1 million. So like that one person, they make a ton of money, but like I make $1 million. He's like 4 times in the 40 years. So once a decade, I've had to fire that person for being, contrary to our culture, not living our values, doing something that like I thought was detrimental to the company. It's like nothing, like I promise you, if you can picture me walking out into the street and like creating a pile of $1 million and lighting it on fire, like that's how convicted I am about this decision. Like that's really, because it's not like someone just jumps into that spot and produces $1 million. Like, no. Yes, we have an organization, we pick up some of the slack, but like for that first year, it's sort of like what I did. And I don't know, that image just like sticks with me so much, which is like, it is, we'll often say like the difference, your values, the difference between like, is it a slogan or is it truly your values, is whether you're willing to make the sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah. It's much easier to keep saying yes to things and tolerate than it is to to make the decision to cut the person. Yeah.
But the thing he also added, which ties to your point, all 4 times, he's like, literally all 4 times, I thought I was being rash. I was reacting to something. I was being too quick. All 4 times, multiple people came up to me and said, "What took you so long?"
Yeah. I can totally relate to that. And that's the thing, like, I'm worried about it because I think I'm acting too rashly, or what's the impact on the rest of the team or company. And then when somebody comes up and says, "Man, I'm glad you did that," or "What took so long?" You're just like, what's the impact of not making the decision? Right. And that's what gets me. It's like at every juncture, you're making a decision. The decision might be to make no decision.
Yeah.
But you're making a decision, and you're also basically, people look at your, feet more than what you say. And so if your actions say that I'm going to tolerate, somebody that's abusive or just some, bad fit, then that's going to be toxic quickly.
100%. We'll tell a lot of leaders we work with, like, every Monday, you rehire your whole team. And every Monday, they reapply, like, they take the job with you again. Like, you're always being tested and they're always being tested. Right. Yes. And the idea of, like, I inherited this person, I inherited this project, it becomes yours. Like, you basically sign off the day that you say, "Yes, I'll take it." And all those mistakes, all those problems, like, you don't get a very long runway to say it's not my fault. Like, as soon as you said yes, like, it's yours.
Now that you're in the role. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Because you make the decision every day to whether to go forward differently or not. You brought up hiring. How much of the coaching and education do you spend around selecting the new hires or understanding the people you have on the team?
Directly or indirectly, I'd say it's probably close to half. Like, if I think about
that's a lot.
It is. But it's interesting. Some of the feedback we get is, like, we're one of the few programs that spends any time on hiring, much less that much. Part of it sort of ties back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Where, yes, people can flex and change, but we have these preferences, we have these abilities, these experiences. And so, of course, the closer I can get to someone who naturally fits with the abilities I need for the role, with the values, the behaviors that we operate with naturally, then the less gaps I have to close in other ways. So if I can, if you can wave the wand and get, like, the perfect capability set with someone who's, like, deeply convicted about your mission and has all the right values, that one decision can save you, like, a huge amount of expense and annoyance and labor and effort down the road. And so if you're going to overinvest in one decision, I think it's who you bring on the team. And what's interesting is, I think people, I'll write about this all the time, the difference between hiring and recruiting. And I can go back into my career and say, like, for the first half of my career, I just hired. And so, like, I define hiring as, oops, I have a job opening. Who's available in the world? Let me pick from the best available. Versus recruiting is saying, okay, I have that picture of what excellent looks like, this vision I'm driving towards. Let me anticipate who I'm going to need a year from now. Okay, where are the 7 to 10 best people who could do that job? Where are they? How do I get to know them? How do I start to build a relationship with them? How do I start to assess whether or not they'd be a great fit for the company? How do I get them interested in my team? So that when that moment comes, there is no LinkedIn ad. There is no job opening. There's simply a conversation with, like, it's time. And they can step in. Like, we have a high degree of, like, confidence on both sides of the ledger. And they weren't the best available. Like, they were the best fit. And when you repeat that process over and over and over, like, that's recruiting. And that's how you get a team of A players, or a team that together works in a much higher order than a team of, like, whoever happened to be available the minute you ran out of capacity.
I love that. I'm a big believer that there's 2 pipelines in every business, the sales pipeline and the talent pipeline, and nobody's paying attention to the latter, or not enough. So how do I do that? How do I maintain this rapport or build these relationships and be thinking, about the folks that I want on the team and that may want to join us depending on the timing. How do you practically teach your folks to do that?
I try to just keep it super simple. So, to your point, one is I do need you to be able to look ahead a little bit, right? You're running a sales team. It's not going to be perfect. You'll have some misses in this, but okay, are we going to open a new territory? Do we turn over our SDRs at a high rate? Like what's the reality of my business? Like where do I think the puck's going over 6 to 12 months? I think I might need to open a new region. And based on the last 2 years of attrition, we're going to need 3 new sales development reps. Like, okay, that's a rough enough shape. And so then you're just saying, okay, I probably want to have 7 to 10 names I'm talking to who could be leading that new region. Do I have an opinion about what the region might look like? Do I have a guess of 2 regions? But the more that I have a pretty decent guess, and the more I can get targeted. And the next thing I'm doing is just starting with my network. Like, okay, who do I try to start from the ideal. Like, okay, if I could wave a wand, who's the dream candidate? Okay, maybe that dream candidate's not gettable. Does that dream candidate have 3 lieutenants? Does that dream candidate have a couple of peers in the industry at different companies? Do I know that dream candidate? Can they introduce me to any of those people? One of the things is just to start to sort of build the snowflake, like build the network, is you talk to that one who's the dream and they're ungettable. I'm like, well, who should we be talking to? Like based on what you've heard, what we're building, what we're doing, like who else do you know? Because those people tend to know people like themselves from industry groups, from communities they're in, just from past experiences from their own organization. And if each person produces 2 interesting people for you to talk to, and you just keep asking that question, you can very quickly get to a couple dozen interesting people. So we went from, I had no idea to a target. I went from a target to, 25 interesting people. And then it's just, what's the one thing I can do a quarter with each of them to stay in touch? Can I send them an article? Can I ask them a question? Can I make an introduction to somebody else in the industry? Can I share a white paper? Can I invite them to an event? Lots of things to do. I read Who, the Who Method, which is by one of the founders of GH Smart. And he talked about, I think it was Aon, the consulting company. The CEO, I believe, has a target of bringing in 40 people a year personally. Right, so it's just shy of 1 a week, right? And then he says that he needs to be having 10 conversations. I think the number's right. And he has to be actively nurturing 10 people to get 1. So he's actively nurturing 400 people at a time. And he carves out a couple hours a week where he's got the list and he's like, who have I not contacted? Who have I not talked to? And he finds looks them up and like, what's going on? Oh, they published a thing on LinkedIn about congratulations on the launch. Congratulations on this. Hey, let me introduce you to this person over here. And he just methodically works through the list and keeps them warm and learns about them and does that. And so that method, it doesn't have to be 400 people, but that method of just having some idea about what you're shooting for, starting to talk to people and sort of splintering out into the people they can introduce you to, and then just methodically going back and like adding value to keep the conversation going. I feel like that's super practical for anybody. It's get you 80-20.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I love your input, Dave, but I think I and others, I know I'll speak for myself, we don't have a talent pipeline ready built. So then it's entirely reactive when you have a performance issue. And so I think they're very tied. The more that I don't have a talent pipeline built, the more that I think, replacing this person, it's just going to be, such a long search and so many recruits. And, I'm not recruiting, I'm hiring.
Yep.
And I'm just going to, what if I spend all that effort and then I end up with still kind of mediocre, but yet I'm under the gun because I still need somebody in the role. Mm-hmm. And, that's a whole other discussion, but I'm under the gun and perhaps I take a mediocre instead of an A player. And so I start to dread these things because I don't have a talent pipeline. Yeah. So personally, if there's a talent pipeline, I'm still going to do everything to develop the people, but I'm not going back to mindset. I'm not as fearful. What I really think it is, at least talking about myself, is that there's a fear. Dave is this key guy. Dave's leading this in my team. And if Dave, walks out the door one day, or if Dave starts underperforming, or whatever it is. I have this fear because I have no pipeline and I'm back to square one. And I need another A player like Dave, and getting another A player like Dave is not easy and not fast. And so I have noticed, if you have that pipeline, even a little bit of it built, maybe not the 400, but even 7 to 10 names, you just have more confidence in those decisions. And what I've noticed, and I love your feedback of what you see as you coach people, is that has led me, using your words, to go from ors to and. I need this and this and this, and we need you to rise to this occasion. Before, I would kind of take my foot off the gas a little bit and say, well, if you can do either of those things, I really needed both, but if you can do either, I guess, like, I didn't say this directly, but kind of in my head, I was like, I guess I'll keep you and I'll tolerate,
less than
mediocre performance.
Less than I need, less than I deserve.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Less than I deserve. That hits the nail on the head. So how much of what you're doing is that, mindset where I'm getting in the way, and that's the thing that's like, you're teaching the practical parts, but how much of this goes back to that mindset, that I'm the mindset getting in the way?
A lot of it is the mindset getting in the way, like as it usually is. I think part of it, you mentioned fear. And a close cousin is pain, right? And so one of the problems that's it's like a very seducing place to get to is what you're describing. I would sort of call, like, what you're doing is allowing there to be like a bit of like, there's like a numbing of the pain, because like if the person was like an unmitigated disaster, you would know what to do.
That's right. You have to. It's an easy one. It sucks, but it's still easy.
And if they were an arguable star, you'd also have no problem. So you're in this middle point.
That's right.
And partially people, I think, get into a vicious cycle, which are, I don't have a talent pipeline, so I don't feel confident holding this person accountable. But because they're covering over some of my pain, I don't have enough conviction to go build a talent pipeline. It's not the most important thing for me to do, right? I have other more urgent things in my business to focus on. This person's giving me B-. It could be worse. Imagine if it was empty. And so because you don't, and so almost the question is like, is it worth flipping it? Like, would you act differently if you were in more pain, not less? Like, I find this happens a lot of times. We'll do something similar. This works less well for a business owner, but works well for leaders, which is they're overwhelmed, they're stuck, they just can't get out of this vicious cycle. And I'll ask them, like, well, what would the business, like, if they fired you tomorrow, what would the business do? Like, because they're going to pick up you've been dealt this hand, you leave, and they're going to pick up the hand. Like, what's their move? Well, how are they going to solve it? And it's amazing how quickly, once people take themselves out of the equation, they're like, oh, they would triage this work, they'd fire this client, they'd upgrade these 2 people, they would do this thing. And then the inevitable question is like, well, why don't you do all those things proactively if that's what they're going to do when you're gone? And part of it is like, they will be in more pain and will be willing to make that. And you right now are sort of holding those things together and sort of soothing, and you're sort of taking this fire and you're keeping it like just shy of blowing up. And for some reason that inversion like really helps them, like, oh, well, if that's what they would do, then I should be empowered to do that. And then I can reap the benefit. And because I'm still here with my capacity, I can use that capacity to do these other important things. And so I think some of that plays the same way here, where you're like, okay, if I fired this person, I'd have to deal with it. I don't have a talent pipeline. Would I just go hire the best person available? Would I go hire, start recruiting, start hiring process, but in parallel, start to do my talent pipeline, et cetera? Okay, if those are the logical things I'm going to do without this person, then that becomes the most important thing for me to do with this person. Because what's your worst case? Like you said in your example, they could do half the job. So you go out into the world and get someone who can do the whole job, and then they get a lieutenant who can do the half the job. And now you've got like a far more like high capacity setup Or that person moves on because they feel marginalized or whatever else, but now you have someone who can do the job better, and you have a talent pipeline for the other three things that are inevitably going to come down the road.
I love that. And it takes me back to I come back to there's two pipelines in every business, and we invest. We not only get CRM and marketing automation and all this stuff, but we have sales team, whether you got SDRs, whether you got, inbound, outbound, all bound, you got all this stuff where you've invested all over the place in some form of sales, no matter what business you're in. And you know that you have to continue to market. You have to continue to generate leads. You know that not all of them will close. It's a funnel, kind of like a talent pipeline. And so that's needed. And then the thing is, I'll ask a lot of people, do you need customers? Yes. Do you need talent? Yes. Which is more important? Oh, the team. Well, not by your actions. You're not investing in a talent pipeline. And we would never run our business such that we're not actively working on getting new customers. Or even if it's a slower business or one that you can only, gain 4 customers a year, some MSPs are in more of like, referral mode. But even in that case, if a big one left, that's not when you would just start for the very first time to do anything like marketing or understanding what you're going to do. So why do we run our talent pipeline that way? Like everything's fine. And then somebody leaves or you have to let somebody go. And then you're caught flat-footed, no pipeline. We would never run a sales side of a business, even a small business that way.
Well, my guess is there's a meaningful difference in the two. In the sales pipeline, I can't sell to myself. So me becoming my next biggest customer, it generates no new money. That's not an actual way to run a business. But I tell myself a trick on the other side. I deceive myself and say, well, I could just jump in. For a small period of time, I could do another hour, or I could get a little bit more out of the team I have, et cetera.
So much truth to that, right? If I'm not a restaurateur, but if I'm a restaurateur and so a great example, I can't cook. So if I start a restaurant, which I'm in no danger of doing, but if I were, right, I would hire an amazing chef. And if they quit,
you'd have no restaurant.
You would just shut down.
Yeah.
I would call in some friends to try to fill in. And then we'd reopen when we had an executive chef.
Right.
Because I am not capable of producing good food like an executive chef. But especially as the let's say the tech person or other ones where you talk about where you really have talents, man, if I don't catch myself just jumping in and filling that gap, because it's like, ooh, I can do that. I'm pretty good at it. I used to do it. I, in some cases, enjoy it. And I jump right in and I become the chef.
Yeah. Right.
And that's horrible.
Right. But it's so natural. Right. And it numbs the pain. It numbs, like you said, you would deal with that chef leaving with fierce urgency. And in fact, because you know that is like a single point of failure, you would probably have a talent pipeline. And you'd probably have an in-house talent pipeline with, I need these 3 sous chefs to be able to step up for 2 weeks while we hire the next executive chef. And I'd have 10 executive chefs that I'm friendly with. And I might have, a network at the local culinary institute. You would have a lot of bets if your entire business was premised on one person showing up that day or not.
Yeah.
But again, if you could cook, you would use that could to rationalize not doing any of those things.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's a big unlock for me. I feel like we could do this forever. What are your top questions you should ask? If I'm in this role, how do I understand how I'm performing as a leader, how my team's performing? What are the questions I should be asking? Maybe they're not those to understand where I am. If I need your help, if I need others' help. I mean, the answer is I always need help, at least personally. But how do I start to understand where I am and how I can improve how I lead and how I show up every day?
I would probably ask different questions to different people. So if I think about, let's just imagine you're founder, CEO, owner, whatever label we all like. I think one of the things we can do that's dangerous is to ask anybody anything, because people will give you an answer, whether it's good or not, whether they have a point of view that's useful. Or the other extreme is that you'll ask them a very open-ended question And what you're going to get back is either a blank stare because it's just too overwhelming of a question, or a lot of randomness that then you are responsible for processing. So I tend to think of it as like, okay, well, what's the ecosystem around me to be successful as a leader? I think if I'm asking my team, like the people who report to me, my leaders, or if I'm a smaller organization, like the folks in the front line, I'm sort of going back to that image we laid out. Like, do they know where we're going? Like, do they, and you can test it. Like, hey, like, tell me what does excellent look like? Share it to me in your own words. Like, tell me the story. If it's not well aligned, I know I need to clarify it. Great. Do you know sort of the key problems in your area? If they do, then great. Do you have solutions for them? If they don't, then I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I've got a leader. So how do I help them see the problems? Because all I need all my leaders to do is really see the problems, solve the problems over and over and over. And sort of like, what else do they need from me? Like, what can I get out of their way? How can I support them? Like, if I could make them go twice as fast or be twice as impactful, what do they need? And I think those are questions that are sort of like fueling the system I'm trying to create. If I had a co-founder, or maybe if I had like really long-term employees who trust me immensely and will speak truth to power, maybe you're also asking them about like sort of strategy and things like that. But usually I'd be looking for that from either like a coach or an external advisor or a board or people I trust who really their interest is in like me achieving my potential and have no real skin in the game. The problem with asking your team is like, they depend on you for a lot. And I don't know, I think even if we believe we've created an open door policy and we've really tried to encourage them to come to us and be able to say anything to us, 99.5% of people either are unwilling to do it in its totality or don't believe you. Like, they've just been burned in other parts of life and are not going to tell you the unvarnished truth. And so I think you need people who are more independent. Those are the ones I'd be asking, like, am I shooting high enough? Do we have the right strategy? Call BS on the things you see me doing. And I think you can create a board of advisors. You can have a literal board of directors. You can have investors. You can have coaches. You can get into EO, YP. There's lots of different ways to get stimulus from people who will do that for you, who have the right incentives. So I'd be looking for that as well.
Love that, Dave. All right. For everybody listening, watching, that's your homework. Take those away, ask those questions, drop a comment and let me know what you come back with. I'd love to learn. I am going to do that. Dave, how can we connect with you? I know you've got hundreds of thousands of followers all over social. So whether it's I'm interested in Dave's courses or coaching, or just want to just follow you because you got some really good social media, and I don't say that about many people. So how do we best connect with you?
Well, most of my stuff comes through in writing. So on social, it's on Twitter or LinkedIn are the two primary platforms for me. We do have a weekly newsletter called The Management Playbook, free to subscribe. There's 60 plus playbooks out there, a bunch of templates. And then we run a live cohort-based program 3 or 4 times a year. You can find that at mgmtaccelerator.com. And awesome. Next one will be about to be announced. We're going to do a slightly different version of it end of June. So keep a lookout.
Yeah. Don't miss out on the opportunity to get connected to Dave in one form or another. Dave, this has been amazing. Thank you for being on MSP Mindset.
Amy, thanks for having me. Great to be here.